Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying with us today and for coming in on our last event with Vesper Flights, Helen MacDonald, and I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Sparks. Oh, and if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll go over them by the end.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Valentina. Thanks, Calvin. And Helen, thank you again for joining us at 1:30 in the morning. We really appreciate your dedication to booksellers. I can say that, personally, since your new author photo was taken in our store. I just want to show everybody because every time someone buys the book in our store, and we have sold a lot already, I say, oh, turn to the author photo. So, it's given me a nice talking point beyond sort of like talking of the merits of the book. I get to talk about, the nice local connection for us. I'm going to let Helen do her keynote here for about 10 minutes, and then I'll come back on with some questions. Of course, I assume everybody on this call knows just how incredible of a writer and Helen is, and H's for Hawk continues to be one of our best-selling books in the store, and has really launched the writing career of someone whose voice I think is really important now more than ever, to use that phrase. Helen gives us a great sense of what it means to be alive in the moment and sort of to be in love with the world and to suffer through the losses that we're suffering, all with a deep exuberance and enthusiasm that is beyond infectious. Every chance I get to spend a little bit of time with Helen, whether virtually or I'll say one time I was able to go to the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles, the weirdest museum you might ever go to, with Helen. Great experience beyond itself. I know I see John nodding. John knows the Museum of Jurassic Technology. And so with that, with Helen's deep curiosity and sense of wonder, and also ability to articulate kind of these feelings, that we're all experiencing, I'm going to hand it off to her, and I'll come back on for a Q&A shortly.
Thank you, Stephen. It was such a pleasure to see you, and it's just constant joy that photograph was taken in your store, and that museum. My God, I left that experience. I'm sure many of you have been to that museum, but those of you who haven't, it's kind of like having an acid trip. You walk out like, I don't know what reality is anymore. I don't even know who I am. So it's really incredible. I'm really thrilled to be with you all. I owe independent booksellers and a lot of you guys, so much gratitude. You were the people who took H's for Hawk under your wing and made it soar. And when I was on tour, I'm really sad I can't be on the ground, as it were, but on my last tour, I met so many of you, and I just treasure all those events and meetings. So thank you so much. Here's the book. I'm really glad it's out in the world and you have it in your hands or in your shops. And as you know, H's for Hawk was a memoir, and this is a collection of essays on very many different subjects, ranging from climbing the Empire State Building at night to watch birds. It's a bit counterintuitive, to deer collisions and the story of my dad at London Zoo pushing a goat over, which I still really worry that he might hate me putting in the book, but it's hysterical. And those of you who've read H's for Hawk and met me as a kind of very, very miserable 30-something will meet many other me's in this book. There's a lot of memoir in it. There's the small me, this weird kid covered in scrapes and grazes from falling out of trees, catching snakes, and then there's this angst-ridden 20-something university student constantly having her heart broken and getting involved in disastrous love affairs. And then there's 20-something living in Wales in this kind of rundown farmhouse full of rats and rain curtains coming through the ceiling and eccentric co-workers. There's lots of me in it. It's not all just sort of dry essays. But the book's heart isn't me. It's the lives around us all, and how strange and rich and beautiful they all are, and how it's possible to stay hopeful. It's hard, but how it's possible to just about stay hopeful at a time when hope seems in very short supply. So for years, the only emotion that the word essay provoked in me was absolute dread, shuddering dread. I was the kind of kid who never did their homework, ever. And it got worse when I went to university. I remember the faces of my tutors looking initially disappointed and slowly becoming kind of, kind of enraged over the time I was there. But now I love essays to absolute distraction, and they seem to me to do things that longer pieces of creative nonfiction can't. They're like little exercises in love and curiosity and wonder And they remind me quite often of what it's like when I go for a walk and I'll find something, or my attention will be distracted from the general blur of the natural world onto something that's quite specific, that sort of leaps out at me like a dropped kind of pigeon egg, or even maybe someone's chucked a CD out of a car window and it's glittering in the grass. And you know, you want to pick these things up and look at them more closely and puzzle out what they mean and what their wider significances are. And that's what writing essays seems to me to be like. And oddly enough, there's something about them, they always seem much more, they seem to be much more involving a reader for me. It's like I'm puzzling something out with a reader right next to me, not working on my own. They kind of open up shared spaces for thoughts that they're not ever delivered as fait accompli. They're kind of like little crossword puzzles that I'm working on with a reader. And although I obviously adore writing longer pieces of work, I think my brain is wired really, really, really well for essays. And that's what makes Vesper Flights a really special book for me. And I don't know about you also, but with these terrible days, my attention span is absolutely shot. I mean, I can't read novels anymore. I can barely get through a half-hour TV program without wanting to kind of clean the kitchen or check my phone or play match 3 games on it. I mean, I have been not coping with this pandemic the way that nature writers are supposed to. There's been a lot of sitting on my sofa, eating pints of ice cream, watching action movies rather than going for long walks in the countryside. But I think that a collection of short pieces is also, there's something about this notion that one could just pick it up at a spare moment and find an essay and read it and then put it down again, that seems to sort of fit my own attention spans at this time. So some of these essays were written for other places initially, like the New York Times Magazine and the New Statesman in Britain, but a lot of them were written just for the collection. And a lot of those earlier pieces were written while I was on book tour. And in fact, you know, they were written to deadlines that were often quite crushing. And I remember joking with my publishers at one point that I was considering subtitling the book "Weeping in Hotel Rooms at 3 a.m. But those essays have been rewritten, so they're not quite as terrifying as they were. And as I began to assemble the collection, something really weird started to happen. I began to see that the essays started talking to one another, which is a really strange feeling, but these themes began to emerge that really seem to speak of this historical moment. And they're themes about belonging and exile and nation and, you know, marginal communities and who gets to ask questions of the natural world and who doesn't. And that was a really strange thing to watch happen and a really exciting thing to watch happen too. It's not a book that tells readers what they should feel or think. I'm a very contrary person, ask my mother. I'll always do the opposite to what I'm told to do. So, but I think the book has got, it has got a very deep message, and it does engage with this notion of the apocalypse that we are currently in. And I think it basically says we should fight with all we have in the cause of lives that are not like our own. We should learn to delight that the world is full of things that are not us and love them because they are not us. And we have to mourn because the world is, you know, full of disappearances, as we all know. And we need to feel that grief before we can move on and do something about it. I always think of that lovely, the sort of notion that we have to mourn to change ourselves and get agency as a result. That lovely line from that Frank O'Hara poem to Aimé Césaire, the Martinican poet, when he says, "We have to fight for what we love, not are," seems a very important moment. So I think one of the things the book also does is, I'm going to drag a bit over, maybe possibly with the timing, and I'm really sorry about that. I've drunk a lot of coffee today and my chronological kind of abilities are a bit shot. It talks about how we put meaning into the natural world. You know, there's a sort of Baudelairean quote that, you know, I think it was stolen by The Usual Suspects. You know, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince us he didn't exist. And the natural world is, we always think it's free of human meaning, and we load it with so much politics and social meaning and weight. And then we read those meanings back from the natural world in order to prove to ourselves that these human meanings are real and they're natural. And I think it's very important that in this book, one of the things this book says is that when you see an animal, it's important to keep those meanings in your head, know what you've given that animal in your mind, what your society has given the animal. And sometimes if you do that, you can just look past those meanings and see this extraordinarily alien, strange, astonishing creature that's really there. And the magical thing is that sometimes the animals can do that for you. Animal encounters can be serious magic. So I'm going to just end with a little bit here about one of those moments where which I hope captures, it's not from the book, but I hope it captures a sort of the touch of the book, the sense of the book and the feeling of the book for you. I was in New Zealand, I was walking up a grassy headland and I was looking down at the ocean and I wanted something to happen very, very much, but it was extremely still weather. It was a beautiful blue day. And I thought nothing would happen at all because in order for this thing to happen, it needed to be windy. And I waited for a long time and nothing happened. And then suddenly the wind came. And the wind came and it was like a benison. And there in front of me, this lump of white started to move. It was like a small child in a ghost outfit. It sort of raised these weird stick-like things and waggled them. And it was a baby royal albatross. And it was about 100 days old. And for 100 days, it had sat there staring out to sea. And when I saw it, I thought of Theseus's ships and I thought of the black sails coming home and of Coleridge's albatross and Baudelaire's albatross, because, you know, I was a good literature student, and all our imperial visions of global exploration and our romantic notions of solitude. And caught up with Coleridge's albatross was this biting sense of human guilt and what we're doing to the natural world. For when big things happen, old stories are always conjured along with the new. And the wind continued to blow, and then the adult albatross came. The albatross came and it was too big to understand. It was as if a dog were hanging there in the air. It came in on the wind, its long knife-like wings bowed and its webbed feet spread as rudders. And it was the most astonishing thing. And as it curved in, it turned its head and looked at me with these mild Madonna eyes down its long squid-cutting beak. And I was absolutely lost for words. Its world was wind and sea and spray and salt and the uplift from rolling swell over the southern oceans. And it looked right through all the stories I'd ever been told about the world. And the air shivered with its newness. It was amazing. It was a very cool moment. And it was serious magic. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. And so is this from your new project?
Yeah. It seems a bit sort of, you know, ridiculous to talk about the new project. I was meant to spend this summer on Midway Atoll in the Pacific, and I couldn't go because of COVID. I hope to go next year. But then the next book is going to be another big book about albatrosses, you know, the US military, you know, all those cool things, and the end of the world. So another cheerful subject for me, but hopefully there'll be jokes in it too. So Midway Island is like, one of my things I learned as a historian was that if you want to write about the really big things, the only way to do it is to focus on something very small and then work outward from it. And I think Midway Island, this tiny 2 square mile blip in the Pacific, is a perfect place to start.
Right, and yeah, and what animal is more emblematic of our sort of modern world than the albatross? And you know, I mean, with all those literary antecedents behind and those echoes, or you know, I wanted to ask you, because you sort of this brought this up, so much about your work. It's personal, and you are very much in it. And these essays or the memoir, you know, they're about you, but they're also, to me, some of the most emotionally kind of visceral moments in these books are these moments of sort of transcendence, and sort of unexpected transcendence. I mean, to go to what you just read there, is like something that you weren't expecting. You had hoped that it would happen, but you weren't expecting it to happen. And I sort of wonder, you know, there's a really great line in the book, and I wrote it down, and if I can find it on my piece of paper here. In my experience, if you go out hoping for revelation, you will merely get rained on. Which can you talk a little bit about, you know, the hard work that goes into these experiences that can kind of come across the page as you know, a numinous experience that you have, and you know, and a lot of times the failures don't get written into it, but that it is work, and that it does take a long view and sort of patience and, you know, energy.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the things about this book that I sort of exposed a bit more vulnerability in it, I think, than I had did in Hawk, rather oddly, because Hawk was very emotional and very personal, but there's a lot more politics in this book because of the times we're living in, but it's also a lot more of what I kind of hesitate to say, the sort of encounters with something more like the divine in the natural world. And I've always been a little bit worried about writing about that stuff, but you know, I tried to write about those feelings, those moments in nature. I think many of us have had them where, you know, it's like time stops, something is sort of revealed. And I think it's a bit like the Wordsworthian, you know, a sense, you know, something more deeply interfused. And, you know, if I were a religious person, I suspect I would consider that evidence of the presence of the divine. But to me, it's just those moments where the astonishing unexpectedness and unlikeliness of me being alive at all to see these things is just phenomenal. And I discovered that the language I needed to write about those things comes from, you know, work on religious experience. And the natural world is able to provide these moments which can be life-changing. I mean, they really, really can. They can renew. And so there are ways of looking at animals that take you out of yourself and lessen your concerns, but there are also these moments which can I don't know, they're like, I always feel they're a little bit like food dye dropped into water. They can change it. They can change the tenor of an entire life if you're lucky. But yeah, if you go looking for them, it's very religious. You know, you go out on a pilgrimage, you don't always get what you want. You just have to kind of pay attention in a particular way and hope that it is revealed to you.
Yeah, and so much of what you do really well in this book and elsewhere, in these essays and elsewhere, is that it's about the perspective. It's how you're approaching it. You know, and so much I think of traditional nature writing to sort of lump things into a genre are very much about like, here I went out looking for this thing, and you know, and some and sort of some of the books that we remember the best, you know, the snow leopard or things like that are, you know, about failure. And so I'm curious, in your work, in these essays in particular, there are often these moments that I read and I felt like you kind of pull the rug out from under us in a way in some of these essays. And I, you know, but I mean in like the most, like in the most kind of necessary way, that, you know, our expectations and ideas of what nature is or what animals are. And, you know, and you kind of, and a lot of times you set things up in this way that it's kind of like you lull us into this false sense, and then you say, but actually. And I'm really curious about that, you know, if whether it's something you set out to do, you know, consciously, or if it's just sort of, this is actually what's happening, and this is, you know, because you have so much experience and you are, you know, you travel the world and you write about people and places, and you kind of undermine, you know, kind of easy assumptions about the natural world.
Yeah, I think it's a really important job now to do this, to try and interrogate very carefully why we value certain creatures and landscapes the way we do, and why we don't value others. I mean, I think it's the grounding to conservation decisions aren't just scientific; they're also, you know, have a lot of this component. And I'm really interested in how animals are always more than we think they are. And I always think of that amazing essay by Annie Dillard on meeting a weasel. I mean, this is I love Annie Dillard. This is no way me, you know, giving her a hard time. But I know when I read that essay about this meeting when I was younger, I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, she meets this weasel, she looks in its eyes, and it's a being of single pure necessity. And it basically, you know, she says, you know, we should all live, we should grab hold of our one thing, and we should never let go like a weasel. And of course, I read it now and I think, weasels also have kits, and they sunbathe, and they, you know, they scratch themselves, and they have fleas, and they might have a hurt leg. I mean, they're a lot more than just this kind of Wolf of Wall Street Nietzschean creature. So I want to do that. I want to challenge the kind of the common ways that we assume animals are, and just make them more complicated and strange. I think there's political and conservation importance in trying to do that. And I'm sorry if it's a bit kind of I don't know. The unmasking can be painful. It's painful for me too sometimes.
But yeah, I mean, but it's necessary, and you wrap it in this exuberant, enthusiastic voice that I think carries these essays along. I felt better after reading them. You know, it's a rare thing to read a book, you know, ostensibly about the natural world, and to feel better, you know, even as all this, you know, because another tension in your work, I think, maybe this goes to that, is sorry, I just closed the door. Speaking of strange animals, our toddler just walked back in the house.
No,
So
hello, but I guess that would take up time. So
I apologize if he crashes through the door. He might come anyway. But you know, so there in your work as well, there's a real tension between what I imagine as being love and grief and loss, and not just personal, you know, human loss as we often just sort of characterize it, but loss of ecosystems, of animals, and you know, so how do you, I mean, like, what is that mental state when you're writing? You know, do you ping back and forth? Is it just sort of overlaying you in this, you know, kind of miasma of?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard now to maintain hope. I mean, I always think of, you know, this Rebecca Solnit talking about how if you're optimistic, you don't do anything. If you're pessimistic and depressed, you don't do anything. If you think everything's doomed, you need to sort of work really hard to open up that space of uncertainty in order for us to walk forward and try and change things. And that's the place I tried to kind of hold. But love and grief, as you know, they're the same thing, right? I mean, grief is just a famous kind of line. It's love with nowhere to go. And the book, in many cases, it's a kind of witnessing of things that we have lost and are losing and disappearing. And that's hard. And I think also trying to kind of get across that, we all, as we age, look back on the things that were around when we were young, like, I remember certain kinds of sort of, cook chill meals that you could buy in supermarkets you can't get anymore. And they were kind of like, restaurants I used to love going to, they've gone now. And somehow those things seem to be of a piece in my mind with the creatures that have disappeared since I was young. We've lost, 350 million birds from Europe since I was born. It's terrifying. But of course, it's not the same kind of loss at all. So I think trying to sort of prize apart the reality of the human losses and the actual deep wounds that we're inflicting on the fabric of the planet is really important. But there's hope. And I always think of that wonderful line from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, where she asks a bunch of students, what would it feel like if you believed the earth loved you back? Which is the most astonishingly revolutionary line of all, And that also sometimes keeps me going. Maybe it's not, maybe there is a bit of redemption possible.
Yeah. Well, that sense too of this loss being so unimaginably large, and in particular in many of these essays where you focus on a specific thing, that kind of can help kind of give us a concrete sense of what this loss is and what it means, and of course we can extrapolate from that. I think a lot of Timothy Morton's, concept of the hyper object being something that we really can't wrap our head around.
Yeah.
And so, these kind of nuggets, these kernels in this book, I devoured this book, and of course I said to Molly, it's like eating popcorn, but it's making me really, it's like sad popcorn.
Sad popcorn. That needs to be on the cover, sad popcorn. But I think also there's that sense that there's, also trying to work out the different losses. So for example, there's an essay in this about trees. There's a lot about American chestnuts and elm trees in Britain, which were devastated by the Dutch elm disease. We think the elm trees in Britain have gone because we can't see their silhouettes, but they're all the hedges around my home. They're all the same elm trees. They just become hedges. And, it's that sense that what we want to see in the landscape, sometimes, it's there. It's just not as we expect it to be. So there's a kind of a little kind of counter message here of resilience and resurgence. And, it is astonishing if you just sort of give nature a bit of a space to do its thing, it can return in astonishing plenitude very quickly, and that's something that's giving me hope right now.
Yeah, similar feeling here, of course, with all the wildfires, to see what will come of this, in some of these ecosystems that where fire has been integral, they evolve together, and so we sort of think like, what will happen, and the fact that nature, if to characterize it in a broad sense, like doesn't need us, we need nature, and of course we're so deeply...
Exactly, which is not, of course, in any way to decry the, absolute horror of what's been lost in the fires and the fact that a lot of those woods are now unrecognizable to people who visited them. But at the same time, the long view for a redwood is different from a human. So it's a very, you start to conjure with notions of time and it's such a, nature's fascinating, Stephen. It's an amazing thing to try and write about.
Yeah, well, and maybe my last question before we go, we do have a couple of attendee questions, but I wanted to ask, so a lot of these essays were conceived of, or written about, before H.S. Verhaeghe kind of launched you into this global stardom, a rare thing for a writer. But I wonder, how much of writing that book has given you opportunities and presented opportunities after the fact, that now you're Helen MacDonald, you wrote this best-selling book, and that you were invited places, and you were given opportunities. And... Yeah,
I mean, a lot of the pieces here, I mean, it's not all set in Britain or America. I mean, there are essays that are set. I went on a assignment with the New York Times Magazine to the high Atacama Desert in Chile with a bunch of space scientists with testing out robots and ways of trying to find life on Mars. And that I would never have got that gig if it hadn't been for H.S. Verhaeghe. And a lot of the places in the book, like, New Zealand, for example, they were all, sneaky trips that I sort of bust out the hotel while I was on tour. So, I mean, the global nature of this book is entirely down to that H's for Hawk's success. So I'm really grateful to that book for many things, not least that I have a car that doesn't break down every 10 miles, but also the fact that it got me to meet some good people and go some really cool places. I mean, again, even the thought of being able to do that now seems bizarre. The idea that international travel was that easy. I think everything has shifted very fast. And there's a lot of anticipatory grief about what the normal is going to be like in the future. I don't know. I mean, it's going to be very interesting to find out.
Right. Yeah, one of the silver linings we keep talking about. We also hosted Helen and Merlin Sheldrake a few months ago, and one of the silver linings is being able to bring two writers who are
right
thousands of miles away to an event, to something like this, and to have a conversation, and to see book-selling friends from across California and elsewhere here today. I'm going to ask you, so John Evans. John, do you want to ask? Can you unmute yourself and want to ask, or should I just read it? I'll read it. Okay. So John has a couple of questions. John says, poems, essays, and aphorisms seem to allow for a space to deep dive into experience. Their brevity contributes to their depth. Are there poets you are reading or would recommend?
Oh yeah, always. So I've been revisiting Frank O'Hara a lot recently, as you may have gathered from that presentation. I just, he's often considered that kind of sort of rather urban poet who wandered around New York writing poems in his lunch hour and typewriters, and he's a very serious poet, but there's a lightness to him that a lot of his poems are about love too, and I just think they're a wonderful kind of, I don't know, counter move really to what's going on around me. The poet I've been reading a lot recently is, I really recommend, is a Melburnian Australian Arab poet called Omar Sakr, S-A-K-R. He wrote a collection called The Lost Arabs. It is absolutely exquisite, and I really, really highly recommend that one.
All right, I'm writing it down. A poet that I recently discovered, or I must have read before, you mentioned R.F. Langley.
Oh, Roger, yeah, he's amazing. Aren't they extraordinary?
Totally, yeah, unbelievable. That was in your Shelf Awareness interview, I think, that I saw that.
Yes, Roger, he was a wonderfully sort of grumpy sort of person, but he just produced these exquisite poems, and they're very, very, I mean, they sort of hide their workings. They're like, what, opening a Swiss watch, and you're like, oh, that's extraordinary, but from the outside, they just look, beautiful. But, he does the sort of syllable counts. You have these poems that, they're very carefully measured. They're great poems. Yeah, Roger Langley, R.F. Langley.
Yeah. And okay, then the sort of a second part from John, he said, why were you worried about speaking to the divine experience, and why did it change?
I don't know. I grew up, say in the essay, I mean, my authorities when I was a kid were New Scientist and National Geographic magazines, and I grew up in a family without faith. In a rather bizarre environment that was I grew up in a Theosophical Society estate. So there was a sort of sense that was weird. And I think it's taken me a long time to realize it's an extremely important part of one's life to kind of honor those parts within you that respond to the ineffable. And it's just, taken me a while to kind of clamber out of my my scientism a bit. The book, one of the things in the book I do say is that I think we have these separate epistemologies these days. For example, about animals, they're not supposed to touch. You can like wolves because they're social canids, or you can like wolves because they're sort of new age symbols, but you can't love both. And I talk a bit about this kind of 16th century emblematic tradition where, it's really interesting to kind of, you can compile a knowledge of animals, for example, that contains all of these different elements, and there's no contradiction between them. They're all to be taken into account when thinking about what that animal means. And I think that my interest in divinity or spirituality is just part of that wider project to kind of bring more in to how I write and make a fool of myself, which I do constantly in my work. I quite enjoy revealing what an idiot I am quite often.
I don't know if we would agree that is the takeaway, but we appreciate how you put yourself on the line for sure. I don't know how we are for time. I think we have a few minutes, so maybe I'll just ask you, because you have a bunch of booksellers here, anything else you're reading lately that you've really loved? You mentioned before a few months back that it was Owls of the Eastern Ice you read, which
that was really fun. I mean, it's funny, because one of the and this sounds like really self-regarding, but there was this whole thing with like, I think Richard maybe started it with his book Nature Cure. There are all these books about how nature can, salve your soul in various ways. And of course, my book, Reyes Book, did that. And when I got this book, I thought, oh, it's gonna be another book about how owls saved someone. And it's not. It's this massive adventure book about this guy going out into the woods and just having a really hard time trying to find these amazing owls. It was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed Merlin Sheldrake's book on fungi. That was really special. I'm kind of a little bit embarrassed now because honestly, I haven't been reading enough during the pandemic. I have been watching Marvel superhero movies and box sets, and I'm deeply ashamed of myself. So maybe on Twitter I'll put some book recommendations down. What else have we been reading? Patrick Wright, the historian Patrick Wright, has done some really interesting. He's just written a new book about to come out about a German novelist who moved to a very rundown island in the Thames estuary in the 1980s, and it's a kind of book about Britishness and Europeanness and how this is a kind of sort of microcosm of life in Britain, but also about Brexit, of course, as everything is right now. So that's a really key. But Patrick Wright's an amazing writer, really good cultural historian. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Valentina's back, so I'm guessing we just have a couple minutes. So I just want to thank you for being up at, like I said, 1:30 in the morning.
No, it's a pleasure. It's such a pleasure. It's such a lovely thing to do. Thank you for everyone for coming along, and thank you, Steve.
Yeah, and of course I'm gonna plug. Tomorrow you're talking. Tomorrow later today for you. Tomorrow for us is that you're having a conversation with the amazing Camille T. Dungy at the Bay Area Book Festival. So if anyone hasn't registered for that and wants to, that's going to be an incredible conversation, and I look forward to seeing you. Or tomorrow, you're later tonight.
My later tonight, and I really hope at some point, in the future, to be back on your side of the world and see everyone properly. But in the meantime, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, all the people that are watching. Thank you.
And thank you, Helen.